Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending where you are joining us from today. What a turnout we have for our webinar. You are joining 230 of your business colleagues from around the world to learn about the future of global identity from the leaders in this field. Welcome to today's webinar. Biometrics, National ID, and the future of global identity. My name is Peter O'Neill, and I am the president of FindBiometrics and Mobile ID World. Our identification industry is moving so quickly now on all fronts: healthcare, payments, law enforcement, banking, mobility, enterprise, border control, national ID, government programs, even automotive. Just about every vertical market is very active and growing. Be sure to stay on top of all this breaking news by visiting FindBiometrics, or if mobility is more your focus, our sister site, Mobile ID World. Now in our 14th year, we cover the market like no one else. We are not just an aggregator of press releases. We pride ourselves on our content with in-depth articles, insights, the largest yearly review of our industry, featured theme months, newsletters, interviews with the leaders in this space, and of course, our now famous webinar series. We are also actively involved in moderating panel discussions on some of the toughest topics at key industry events. For example, we just moderated a very lively panel discussion last week in Tampa with Brett McDowell of the Fidel Allowance, Jen Behrens from Privacy IM, Mike Harden, the Deputy Director at U.S. Customs and Border Protection, and Jim Sullivan from BioKey. Our topic was outreach and public perception issues. And that was a very tricky one. And for those of you involved in mobility, in 3 weeks I will be moderating again this year a biometrics panel at the super hot payment show, Money 2020, with MasterCard, USAA Bank, Dayon, and Morpho on the panel. We firmly believe in taking biometrics to these end user vertical markets like payments and healthcare. And this month, all month long, we have been focusing on national ID. We have a lot to cover today, so I'm going to jump right in. Please note, to ask a question, just type it into the dialog box in the Go To control panel on the right side of your screens. And please do this at any time. Don't wait until the end, as this will give us an opportunity to manage your questions, and we'll do our best to answer as many questions as possible, and there'll be quite a few given the number of attendees today. This webinar will last about 40 minutes in total, and will be recorded and available at FindBiometrics.com. I would like to now take this opportunity to thank our sponsors for their continuing support: NEC Corporation of America Biometrics Solutions Division, Greenbit Biometric Systems, and a special thanks to Acuity Market Intelligence. And to start off our discussions today, we are very fortunate to have with us none other than the industry's brightest, boldest, and best analyst and consultant, Maxine Most. Max is the principal of Acuity Market Intelligence, and I've known Max well for about the last 14 years, and she is known for providing original, thought-provoking, accurate, and very reliable industry analysis. Basically, Max is the best in the business. Now, Max will be providing us with an industry overview to kick things off. I am so pleased to introduce our presenter today, the mighty Maxine Most. Take it away, Max.
Thank you, Peter. I appreciate the introduction. I just want to give a brief overview of where we are right now in terms of the global national ID market as a starting point for this conversation. The first chart you see shows you the volume of national ID and EID cards. This is a chart that represents the historical data as well as future projections. And as you can see, the world is shifting very much to EIDs. And EIDs in this case include national IDs that have integrated smart chips in the cards that have been issued. Go ahead, next slide. This second slide just shows you the additional volume that's generated from non-smart cards, non-smart card programs. So in other words, there's no chip in the national ID card, but the program itself does integrate biometrics. So there's still a number of countries out there that are using biometrics as a means to authenticate, to issue and authenticate national ID holders that have not migrated, excuse me, to smart card use. And you can see we're getting close to a little over 800 million cards a year, and then that volume drops off. Now, the reason the volume accelerates and then drops off, this is true of the previous slide as well, is when smart card programs are initially rolled out, or national ID programs are initially rolled out, I should say, there tends to be a bump in initial enrollment. Over time, those programs tend to even out, and enrollment will be more even over the years as people are issued cards and then they cycle on either 5 or 10-year validity periods. But when these initial programs are established, there's big bumps. Now, one of the critical components of this forecast is, in terms of what you're looking at, is India is now projected to start a card program, smart card program, to go along with their population, which they've been working on now for quite some time, and I think they're at about 600 to 700 million people enrolled. That's still a question mark. Go ahead, next slide, Peter. But that does represent a bump in the overall annual volume. This chart is very interesting because what you're seeing here really is the circulation volume. And keep in mind, a huge percentage of this are large population countries. For example, China has a smart card national ID program. So obviously, that's an enormous percentage of the overall market. But again, as you can see in this chart, EIDs are slowly overtaking NIDs in terms of total circulation, and will continue to close that gap outside this forecast period. Okay, Peter, go ahead. Next slide, please. Now, this is a list of countries that are still on the holdouts, and these are the countries that will impact whether or not the global market on an annual basis or in terms of total circulation will increase. The United States, I don't think it's likely that we're going to see a national ID. There's a lot of hoopla right now over real ID taking effect and people essentially not being able to use their driver's licenses to get on airplanes because each state has not yet complied with real ID. There's a lot of hoopla now about immigration in the country, and people are talking about E-Verify for everybody. So there's some initial issues now, or some interesting issues now, that could potentially move the U.S. in that direction, but I don't necessarily see that happening anytime soon. And these are other countries. The Philippines now is debating, I think this is for the third time in a decade, they're debating having a national ID. Other countries that really aren't likely to incorporate national IDs anytime soon. And then you have the big countries that are in process. As I said, India is projected at 2017. We'll see. These programs tend to get pushed out, particularly in large population countries. Nigeria is in process. A lot of controversy about that program. Russia is also in process. And Mexico, which started a pretty ambitious national ID program a few years ago, enrolled kids, and now it's kind of stalled. So that's essentially where we are today. Next slide. So here's the forces really that are driving the current national ID market, and I think it's very interesting. I spent the last 2 days at the EID conference in Washington, D.C., and heard a lot of talk about the movement towards the digitalization of secure identity credentials, including national IDs. And I think this is really where we're going. There's a lot of forces that are going to drive these documents into the digital age, and if you think about the fact that the first smart national ID card was introduced in 2000, I believe it was the MyCat card in Malaysia, and now we're 15 years out, and we've had pretty massive adoption. If you look at the previous charts that I showed, I would say in the next 15, 20-year cycle, we're going to start to see this movement towards digitalization, which means your credentials essentially in mobile devices, primarily your smartphone. And what I think is going to be very interesting is as biometrics become mainstream, as smart mobile devices continue to grow and replace all mobile devices, so that there will be, feature phones will essentially become archaic. We will have this global platform, and as we begin to rely more and more on biometric identification in general, as this moves to the cloud, as we become comfortable with using biometrics and NFC, which will be embedded in all of our devices, that's going to change the dynamics so that we will see these devices move to a digital format. Initially, it may be essentially a companion to our existing credential, a picture, if you will, on a mobile phone. Eventually, I think it moves to a completely different context where we're used to seeing these physical credentials, but eventually I think identity tokens become truly digitalized and exist in our mobile devices, and we may have to get beyond the idea of seeing a card with our picture on it and saying, oh yes, that's my national ID. And is there one more slide, Peter, or are we done?
There is, but before we move away from this slide, Max, I can't help but think that as I look at this one, all these different factors that are affecting the marketplace, you can almost change out, national ID for any particular vertical industry, automotive, healthcare, payments, and you'd find the same kind of activity happening. Is that correct?
It's my perspective is that this is the next wave of evolution in terms of how we identify ourselves in any context, whether it's with the government credential, an enterprise credential, identifying patients in a healthcare scenario, your driver's license. I mean, this is the future of ID, and I think there's a lot of challenges in terms of having certified devices and what it means to have a hardware-based token versus a software-based token, the security, the encryption, data management. We just saw this, with a huge data breach in the U.S. government where they were amazingly storing images of people's fingerprints that weren't encrypted or secured in any way, and they were breached. So there's a lot of pieces, technology pieces, that will need to be put in place to make sure that we're doing this in a secure way, but I think it's inevitable that this is how we're moving. I mean, some people would argue you're going to have a chip inside your body. I don't know if I want to go that far, but I'm pretty happy to invest it all in my mobile phone, quite honestly.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so as Peter said, this is sort of a conceptual image of what's happening with national IDs. I mean, they started as paper, they moved to cards, they became polycarbonate cards with embedded chips. We have now multi-function polycarbonate cards with embedded chips where we're putting a lot of our other ID credentials into that token. We're seeing it move now, as I said, to a mobile device, which for most, people seem to think, oh yes, we're going to have the image of the token or the card in my device, but in the long run it becomes embedded in our mobile device. And as Peter said, you can map this out for any number of ID scenarios where when we start having mobile devices where we have NFC and biometrics embedded in those devices, and we have cloud-based identity services. We just saw Morpho make an announcement that they're introducing that technology, and I'm sure other companies will follow. This is the world we're living in. This is the transition we're going through, and it's going to fundamentally change the way we interact with IDs, we think about identifying ourselves, and I actually believe, contrary to a lot of people, that it has the potential to enhance our privacy as we have more control over our personally identifiable information.
Well, Max, thank you very much for that update. And what I'd like to do now is introduce our other panelists for today from NEC Corporation of America Biometric Solutions Division, John Dowden, the Senior Product Manager, and from Greenbit Biometric Solutions, Christian Rutigliano, who is the Sales Director. And of course, Max will also be participating in this. So the first question to our panel is, what are the biggest benefits to governments and citizens in countries that have rolled out national ID programs? John, can I ask you to start out with this one, please?
Yeah, I think the biggest benefit, Peter, is going from an intense manual paper-based system. You look at South Africa as an example. You know, they really couldn't keep up enrolling citizens into their national database. So when they got their APIS system, they were able to automate that enrollment and then do a duplicate check against the existing database to kind of what Maxine said, where you get a true identity for that citizen, and then that citizen gets, options to use that valid identity to get the needed government services. So that's the biggest and primary benefit, going from a paper-based system to really electronic system where you get that new credential. Whether it has its EID or NID, that depends upon where that country is, with their overall policy and plan.
Thanks, John. Christian, can you jump in there?
Yeah. First of all, thanks to Maxine for the most interesting introduction and the overview of the actual market, and hello to all the attendees who are listening. I fully agree on what John just outlined. Obviously, the so-called social or financial inclusion of people who did not have an assured identity up to now, thanks to enrollment projects, especially biometric-based enrollment projects, those people have now the possibility to participate in an upward social mobility. And obviously, we have the benefits for the government. The government obviously is being defrauded for billions and billions of dollars, along with insurance companies and the financial institutions, due to people having been enrolled several times into the same entitlement project, and as such are double dipping into the breadbasket. And this obviously is a practice that will come to an end once we are talking about assured identity, and everyone can just claim to be one person.
Thanks, Christian. Max, did you have anything you would like to add to that?
I just think that, this is going to permeate, as you brought up when I was speaking, this is just going to permeate our entire concept of what identity means within, every context in which we're identified. So whether it's moving people towards availability of services, or, as Christian mentioned, or actually allowing the government to efficiently manage identity. I just think it's going to make, it's going to essentially, over time, we're going to see a massive transformation in how all this is handled.
Thank you. Second question. Privacy has become a particularly hot topic in government biometric deployments, particularly in the United States. Do privacy issues pose a challenge to vendors in the national ID market? And Christian, maybe you could start us off on this one, please.
Absolutely. Obviously, as a vendor in the biometrics field and the fingerprint biometrics field, privacy is an issue we run into for practically since we are on the market. It's getting better. People are getting more aware of biometric programs and what they can actually do to enhance their daily life in terms of better services and less fraud due to identity theft. However, obviously, people are giving away something which is most precious to them, which is their biometric identity. And we have to make sure that best practices are followed all across the scale to make sure that the databases containing biometrics are absolutely up to par in terms of IT security, and that we don't have to receive repeated bad news as we just did with the OPM scandal. I think we have to work, and all the industry, we have to work together to make sure that this will not happen again in the future, so that people feeling actually comfortable to biometrically enroll in national ID programs.
Very interesting, Christian. It's one of the reasons why we had Privacy Advocate in our panel discussion at the Global Identity Summit last week in Tampa. Couldn't agree more. You have to make sure that you're involving all parties in the discussions. John, can I ask you to give your comments on this one, please?
No, I kind of tend to see it just like Christian mentioned. NEC, we always, design in computer security regarding, authentication, access control, encrypting the database. NEC, we store a number of databases for certain customers here in the United States, and we protect them. But I think something else is like, Maxine mentioned and Christian is, we do follow privacy by design when we work with our customers to configure and deploy this system. And you need to let the subject know, what they're enrolling into, what information is coming from them, or they can opt in or opt out. Obviously, with national identity, there is a benefit, to the subject that they can get that we're seeing that will be, as Maxine kind of outlined, available in the future. So there's a benefit for them for enrolling in these systems that obviously vendors have to protect and ensure the integrity and security of those data records.
Well, thank you, John. And Max, before I ask you to jump in on this, I'm going to try and incorporate some questions from the audience. We're getting a lot already. So I'm going to, and this has to do with this particular topic. So one of the questions that we were just asked is, what are those best practices required to protect people's personal identifiable biometric information? And what can technology do to help? Max, can you tackle that one for us?
Well, I don't know. I'm probably not the person to talk about best practices. I'm guessing my colleagues who actually implement this technology are better equipped to answer the question. But I do want to make one comment, and this is relative to this idea that we're moving towards a mobile-based identification system. There was an article in the Washington Post yesterday about Apple's new privacy policy, and I think this is something that I think is actually good, that we're going to see, see more companies, not just the hardcore vendors like NEC and Greenbit, who really understand how to protect data, but that this understanding of privacy is moving out across this global ecosystem where a lot of different folks, whether it's handset manufacturers or retailers or banks that are incorporating biometrics, that people are much more aware of the implications of managing biometric data and the privacy that's associated with it. And I think the fact that biometrics is going to become mainstream in the mobile world. I mean, Acuity projects that by 2020, every smart device will have some kind of embedded hardware or software biometric. And that we're training millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of people to use biometrics, and that we're expanding this understanding of what it means to manage the privacy of this data and the urgency of doing so out into the broader marketplace.
Thanks, Max. John, maybe you could jump in on that question we got from the attendees about best practices.
I think best practices is really, following what is privacy by design, discussing that, the biometric system you're deploying for the government agency. And there's about 7 basic principles. It's proactive, not reactive. I think we've seen recent results, here in America where we've seen data breaches of commercial systems or government systems, but privacy is a default setting. I think also privacy embedded into design. And then also, really, complete functionality, protection, and then end-to-end security is really what's needed. And also making sure only those true valid operators have access to that, but also the subject has access, to the data being stored as well. And then most importantly, visibility and transparency to make sure the system's open. And then finally, I think respect for the data that's being captured from the subject needs to be one facet of the overall biometric solution, being deployed, with keeping privacy in mind.
Thank you very much, John. Christian, would you like to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think Maxine and John already covered most of the important points whenever privacy is concerned and best practices. given the fact that, as John correctly mentioned, data is sent down from one company doing the enrollment to many other pieces inside the solution until they finally end up on the back end. I think the whole supply chain here needs to work together and trying to make the very best effort as per international standards for security, especially in terms of encryption, to make sure that these data cannot be leaked or eavesdropped on any way misused.
Thank you, Christian. Now, Max was talking about mobility, so I'm going to ask a question specifically around that. It's the fact that mobility is involved in national ID, and now that consumer handsets are shipping with built-in biometric authentication, how has mobility already benefited national ID deployments? Max, you want to start out on that one?
Well, certainly, generic mobility is in a lot of locations. Enrollment isn't done entirely in a mobile environment. That's been going on for a long time. So that component of the mobility in terms of capturing data and transmitting data and issuing credentials has been in place for a long time, particularly obviously in developing economies where there's limited infrastructure. The real question is, how does that translate onto the end user side? And I'm not there are several countries, like I know, for example, in Austria, they've had a digital form of national ID credential for quite some time. It's not completely linked to mobile devices per se, but this idea of separating the credential from the physical token is certainly in place in Austria and a number, I think it says one or two other European countries particularly that I'm aware of.
Thank you, Max. Christian, you want to comment on the mobility aspect?
Sure. I think that the national ID projects have brought a lot of awareness to biometrics in general, the use of national ID cards. And we see them now on cell phones every day. This helped to further raise awareness and to, let's say, give biometrics a better reputation than it had in the past. And biometrics were more or less linked to law enforcement applications. And it's funny that we're asking about mobility. When I was flying into the United States, where I'm currently at, I saw an ad at the airport for actually a mobility app where you could create a digital passport on your mobile phone, which then would be accepted by the Customs and Border Protection and the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency. So I think we're already quite there. And when I recall the slide Ms. Maxine showed us during her presentation about the digitalization of secure ID credentials, I think this will be the way to go. We will have, at the end, not a physical ID title anymore. We will have a certificate, a digitally signed certificate, first on our cell phone, and one day for sure we will have cloud-based ID.
Thank you very much, Christian. John, do you have any further comments about the mobility aspect?
No, I think both Maxine and Christian hit it very well. Like Maxine said, for countries in South America, South Africa, and India, which have enrolled a large part of their databases, they relied upon mobile solutions, a portable solution, to do that enrollment. And like Christian says, we're beginning to see, and what Maxine alluded to, really that EID to be available not as a physical card, but really as a token that would be embedded in your mobile device. And I think we're starting to see that, be available. So, that's kind of the next step, the next challenge for the biometric industry, and then also for the identity card industry as well.
Next question. Oh, sorry. Yep, go ahead, Max.
I just want to make a quick comment about what Christian said. I think what he's talking about is the mobile app for the APC kiosks. My understanding is that CBP is not accepting a, quote, mobile passport per se. I haven't heard anything about that, but I do know that there's an application that's available when you're using the automated passport control kiosks, where you can actually enter all that data in your mobile device rather than having to enter into the kiosk. I think that possibly is what he's referring to, unless there's something else I don't know about.
Oh, you're right. I was referring to this, called Mobile Passport.
Yes. Yeah, it's an incremental step. It's a great first step, but we're not quite there with the passports yet.
Okay, next question. Can national ID be seen as an enabler for other biometric markets such as healthcare and finance? And Christian, can you start us off on this one, please?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think biometrics and the national ID programs using biometrics are definitely an enabler for other verticals. And I'm thinking mostly about the African market, where we have done a couple of bigger installations recently. And along with our partners, we've seen once the enrollment procedure comes to an end, the governments are already thinking about what kind of spin-off projects could we actually develop out of these national ID projects. And we see the first healthcare projects, which actually are based on the national ID enrollment, are coming out. We see central banks bring up projects for practically the financial sector to provide secure credentials to their customers, always based on the secure, already done national ID project. So I think all these national ID projects will greatly benefit the citizens in numerous ways in their daily work with the government, and obviously in their daily private life, when it's just up to some presumably simple things like financial transactions or getting insurance certificates or stuff like this.
Thanks, Christian. John, do you have a comment you'd like to add in there?
No, I think we're beginning to see that, like in South Africa and India, just going from the national ID, now those authorities are allowing more commercial use cases, especially for healthcare. I know personally myself, I would like to see some type of biometric ID, for the sake of better implementation of HIPAA, providing privacy in my records. And I noticed talking with the doctors, even this week, visiting them, that they would like to have that too, to ensure the security and privacy of those records, and also benefits from automation in getting that workflow that happens faster in the office. So yeah, I think people are looking for it, and that's probably the next horizon that we will see emerging in the marketplace.
Thank you very much. Now we are getting a lot of questions in from the attendees, and I'm mixing them up right now. So this is one from the attendees, and Max, it says, for Max, with respect to the U.S., do you see the federal government taking the lead role in the development and governance of a national EID program? Or, given the climate of public distrust of federal institutions, e.g. OPM breach, etc., will individual states themselves need to pioneer EIDs that could be later integrated? Or is there a future in which a non- or quasi-governmental entity develops and manages such a program? Big question. Max? Max, are you muted? We lost you there for a second. Christian or John, do you want to tackle that?
Yeah,
wow, that's a big question. I think, Peter, with a lot of political implications. I for one would like to see that, but how it gets implemented, whether it's the federal government or at the state level, or maybe a commercial version of that, that's a big question. And I think that's where you need a lot of debate. And I'm sure we'll probably see that a little bit. We're seeing cyber be discussed, in the upcoming presidential election. So, but I think identity and privacy probably needs to be part of that as well. And I think our federal government agencies are working on that as well.
Christian, do you have a comment on that?
Yeah, I fully agree with John. Obviously, the issuing of safe credentials and ID for now should be more or less in the hands of federal governments, national governments at all. But as to the question if one day this might be managed by private organizations as well, we'll have to see. Outsourcing is always interesting also to governments, but I think we're talking about very, very important information here, which is your identity. So I think for now we will stick with national and federal governments to care about at least the most important ID projects.
Thank you very much. And Max, are you back with us, or are you still?
Yeah, sorry, my technology, my internet connection died. So.
Oh dear. Did you hear?
I think the technology is going to have to
yeah.
get a little bit more reliable before we can use it for national IDs. No, if you could repeat the question, I will jump back in. Apologies.
Well, and this was actually addressed to you. With respect to the U.S., do you see the federal government taking the lead role, or will it go to a non- or quasi-government entity that develops and manages such a program?
In the United States, as far as a national ID?
As far as governance of a national EID program.
I just don't, I can't see it happening. I think that, given the state of affairs in the U.S. right now, it's just too much of an issue. I think, there's a number of states now that, as I said, folks are at risk of not being able to board on an airplane because their driver's licenses don't comply with Real ID. And what is that, 10 years old now? So I think what you're going to see is commercial solutions for identity being developed and the government adopting those. Now we have this NSTEC program, which is this, private-public partnership to try to advance digital identity, trusted online identity in the United States. But in the end of the day, I really think you're going to have private solutions being driven by requirements across the board. For example, the DoD is the government wants to use mobile identity within the government enterprise. The DoD has been working extensively on this as well, and so I think you're going to have standards that are going to come up through government, civilian, and military ID that those kind of technologies will be then used across the enterprise in non-government contexts, but I don't think we're going to see a, quote, national ID program anytime soon in the United States.
Thank you very much. Now, we're getting a lot of questions around which types of biometrics. So this one question, I think, sort of sums it up. Are certain types of biometrics or biometric techniques better suited for ID cards than others? For example, biometric encryption versus template versus raw images, or what types of biometric modalities are best suited? John, can I ask you to start off with this one, please?
Well, I think I really like what was implemented in India, really a trimodal system, where you have finger, face, and iris, being captured for the enrollment to do the background check, because sometimes you have challenges within populations. You have people who, if they do a lot of manual labor, their fingerprint ridge detail is scrubbed down. Then you can rely upon, all the additional modalities. Some populations you see, beards and other things covering the face. And then when you have those additional modalities, after you process and grant the identity, then you can take advantage of those in different use cases. For instance, in healthcare, a fingerprint may not want to be used because typically, it's contact-based, where they may want to use contactless. That's where facial recognition, iris recognition can be used. In addition to what they use in India, another modality can be voice recognition. Only about 10 to 30 seconds of a spoken passphrase is needed to do voice recognition. So they really should be multimodality. Really, you can use those modalities, multiple numbers, to do the background check, and then you can branch out, provide additional services and benefits, on a single modality for the use case for authentication and verification.
Christian, can I get your take on that one, please?
Sure. Fully agree with John. So multimodal biometrics, especially for large-scale ID enrollment programs, are pretty much mandatory. Fingerprints are still the most important biometrics on this one, just given by the fact that all the big biometric legacy databases existing out there are fingerprint-based and coming obviously from the law enforcement sector, which is then used to check against existing blacklists. Obviously, iris is coming out more and more, and it's a very, very important biometric, especially in the range of doing deduplications. And in India, it has shown, as John correctly mentioned, great results. And obviously, the face technology, made 2D or 3D, is getting more and more traction, and so it's going correct to acquire face images as well in these large enrollment programs. When we're coming then to the authentication side, so once people are enrolled and now they have an ID title, now obviously we can discuss which kind of biometrics on the authentication side could be better than others. I know in India they are looking at fingerprint and more at small iris authentication devices, which are obviously a good choice given the problems that, especially in emerging economies, you can have with fingerprint enrollments where people just don't have fingerprints left. That could cause then obviously certain issues with authentication. But overall, multimodal it is. Maybe we can add in the future other different biometric technologies. I'm thinking about finger or palm vein. This could be something that has already been used in the commercial space, especially in the financial space, or eventually even DNA.
Thank you, Christian. And Max, we're getting a lot of questions in right now, so I'm going to try and move through them fairly quickly because we are at the end of our time limit, but because we're getting so many questions, I'm going to try and deal with just a couple more. Is a lack of international standards impacting the rollout of interoperable ID cards? Max, can I get your take on that, please?
Well, yeah, I mean, yes, but I think that's inherent in a national, when you're talking about a national identity program, because there's obviously there are some standards in the card industry, but these are highly unique programs that are tuned to the specific regulatory, legal, operational, and necessarily the technology standards, but the total concept and operations and vision for how these identity credentials work inside a specific nation. I mean, they're obviously in Europe. They're trying to create a interoperable framework, but there's specific contextual reasons why, because the EU exists as a group of nations. They're doing the same thing in Africa, where East African countries are working together to do that, but there's nothing inherent in a national ID that requires that kind of cooperation.
Thank you. John, do you have anything would you like to add on that particular standardization question?
No, I think Maxine hit it pretty well. Usually the countries establish, their standards, and I think there are some, especially on the travel, we see some, but there's not full interoperability as far as traveling. I think ICAO has taken some leads to grant that. But you look at the global entry system as an example of a good system for work here in the United States, but it only extends a little bit beyond our borders as far as going overseas.
And Christian, do you have a final comment you'd like to add in there?
I think Maxine and John covered it pretty good, but obviously international IDs, being from Europe, we know what we're talking about in Europe when we're talking about an internationally accepted standard, just for 16 or 28 European countries, and we're there working on it for, I don't know, more than 10 years now, and we're not quite there yet. At the end, I think this would benefit mostly people who are traveling, since on a national scale, there might be even other standards applying to make sure that a person is actually the person he claims to be. But as far as traveling is concerned, obviously, having some international standards to facilitate traveling, this would be something that we really hope that could come out one day.
Okay, well, I'm sorry we can't deal with all the questions that we are getting in. It's been a very, very interesting, and I want to thank all of our panelists. And so please join us in 2 weeks for our next webinar in just 2 weeks. This is going to be a big one, Mobile Biometrics and the Next Generation of Digital Identity. You don't want to miss this one. And also, I'd like to thank all of the attendees for participating in our webinar, and a special thanks to NEC and Greenbeck, and a very special thanks to Max from Acuity Market Intelligence for her expert analysis today. This concludes our webinar. Thank you very much for attending.